Good afternoon. You've heard some wonderful talks. I don't know if I'm going to stick to what I had prepared, but I think the last talk by Vimlendra I think puts it in a nice context. Mine is going to be providing you with some of the basic underlying features of what is driving our misuse of resources. So when Gauri asked me to talk about Swachh Bharat, for our foreign visitors, Swachh Bharat is about cleaner India, a clean India. What does that mean? It's not just taking a broom, cleaning out the dust within your compound walls and putting it outside, which is the proverbial one you see in all these cartoons, somebody in these apartments getting dumped on the head. But how do you really get to a system which is a functioning earth system, which is a prerequisite for a thriving society? Now the government has allocated a lot of resources. You heard Vimlendra talk about 10,000 crores for the Yamuna, several times more for the Ganga. I mean, are these all down the drain? Clearly there is a will to allocate more resources, but how do we go about it? I think we need to be a lot more strategic, and I think there was also talk about action. I think the other talks this morning that inspired me, all of them of course, but about the environment that Dr. Kelly Traver talked about. It's not just genetics, but the environment in which these kids, all of us, grow up in. And I think we need to really understand how to really make the connections and understand what the drivers are and really how to address these problems. So let me start with what the Swachh Bharat is. I'm not going to talk about the cleaning campaign. Of course, the spotlight has been shown by the government on these issues of cleaning the country, but it's about getting to Swachh Bharat. How do you really sustain the functioning ecosystems, the rivers, the pollinators? I mean, there are lots of things about the colony bee collapse. I mean, there are lots of evidence that humans are making a major difference in the way the ecosystems function, and ultimately if, like the Neanderthals, all the other species also die out, it's because of us Homo sapiens. So of course education system has to improve, the way we understand has to improve, but it's not just the technology, it has got to be the will, and there's also all these issues about access, rights, equity. I mean, all these words I've heard this morning. So let me see where to start, and I will talk about the urban issues. It's not that I'm neglecting the rural parts, but the urban water issue, the reason for urban water is because India is fast urbanizing. Within another 20-30 years, India will be a urbanized country. More than 50% of our population will be living in urban centers. So there is a huge issue of access to water, and I think Vimlendra also talked about river, instead of a river basin, people associated themselves with tap water. I have some nice pictures for you to see. I mean, this is a fact. It's a sorry state of affairs 60, 70 years after our independence. Then of course, not just the water, but what happens to the wastewater? He also talked about what's going into the rivers. But what's really happening, people living, using those waters, a bit of the analysis of problems. I won't go into great detail given the limited time, but some possible solutions. We need to show action. So how do we really go about it? With evidence, with some clever thinking, with new technology, but I think for every challenge there's a solution. I'm sure you're all familiar with urbanization being the inevitable evolutionary pathway of economic growth. Gandhiji talked about village republics, each one self-sufficient. I think we are probably not going to be in that way, but a network where people, the slow food, the slow economy, I mean, all these things are beginning to come about, but that's not the only solution. So we need to understand what are the drivers. India is also along that path. Already 570 million will be living in urban centers within another 15 years. Most of the jobs will be created there. These are the engines of growth. The government is talking about 8-9% growth, GNP, GDP, but what about the gross national happiness? I think Shiv is very much familiar with all these things in Bhutan. So how do we achieve a more sustainable form of living? And so if services in these urban centers do not keep up, what's going to happen? There's a huge gap between supply and demand. And without going into, again, more details, there was a McKinsey report which talked about the need for another $1.2 trillion of investment needed in augmenting supply, managing the demand, of course, giving incentives and so on. I'll show you a little bit more about that, and also treating the wastewater. In all this, it's the poorest who suffer the most. Just look at New York. The cost per cubic meter is probably less than $1. In Chennai, India, from where I come, it's closer to 2.75. I mean, this is a basic need. People have to live. It's not just for humans, for all living beings. So I'm also a little puzzled when people talk about rainwater harvesting, conserving, keeping water within your compound wall. What happens to the species outside? Much more holistic approach. But in any case, this is the state of affairs where pipe supply and informal supply, tankers, I mean, there's a whole of a network of the political economy which is very difficult to change, but let's see what can be done. So what are the challenges? Sufficient water of a certain quality, at least at an affordable price, when and where it's needed in a sustainable manner. This is, and disposing the wastewater without harming public health. So how do you analyze, how do you go from source to sewer? So these are pictures of the tap water economy. People lining up with all these buckets. And what are these? Like electrical cables, these are the pipes that go into a common bore well or a well. And so you can see the real challenge people have, 60–70% of our country, just living, just basic survival. But then look at the people on the left. Some use water wastefully. This is watering the garden, while others wait for hours. And then from Bangalore, where I just come, you see the center. This was the old city. I don't see the the dark blue. This is the core area of Bangalore, which gets the piped water from the Kaveri River. All these peri-urban areas, fast expanding, they have to depend on groundwater. And you will see another picture. So cities don't have enough rainfall to live within their water footprint. They depend on water from distant places. Increasingly, there are conflicts with the rural water users. Average consumption, if you really want to see, in India, it's basically less than 100 liters per day. And there again, this is an average. You might have 250 and you might have 30. Whereas in the US, I'm not saying we can all aspire or try to be at this, it's unsustainable, but this is the state of affairs in our country today. And supply is intermittent. There's no such thing as a 24/7. You might open your tap, get the water like in the hotel here, but this water is basically piped water for 2 hours when it's pressurized, but the rest of the time. So you have all these structures, the syntax tanks, the overhead tanks and so on. And so if you really see, the supply is not sufficient, and it's also not, it's only intermittent. The infrastructure is also very poor. Investments have not been made. Groundwater governance problem. No water in that hand pump. But then the market, however inefficient it is, a private groundwater supply has come in, tankers, and there's no law that prevents individuals from their land from having bores which can go deeper. There's no law which regulates use of what is a public property. It's seen as privatized. But groundwater is also disappearing fast. There are red zones. You see all the red, these are all overexploited areas. And these deep aquifers are also supplying agriculture. So if you're growing sugarcane in Rajasthan, or you're exploiting water at a level which is no longer sustainable, then I think we need to change the cropping patterns. There's a very interesting book on virtual water. If you have not seen it, if you just Google it, you will really see how much water it takes to grow 1 kilogram of rice or wheat, and what happens to that. I mean, you're exporting water in effect. So the aquifers are being depleted. Then what happens to the water that goes out after the use? So this is a scene from Bangalore about the sewage problem. And this is the Pina industrial estate. All these which adds to the GNP. The water might be not just black, it might be okay during the time when the Pollution Control Board office is operating from say 10 to 5, but the discharge, the color is green and red and so on at night. And just 2 days ago, we are doing some 24-hour monitoring of discharge of these effluents, which ultimately goes into the Arkavati basin, which is part of the Kaveri and supplies water to Bangalore, and was beaten up. So it's a very poor governance system, corruption is rampant. So we can all wave our hands and say the situation is horrible, it's not solvable, but I think there is now a groundswell of public discontent, and there is some change, some hope in the offing. Now with the growth of middle class, people are demanding something from the politicians. So how do you find solutions? So a few examples. Curbing demand for the most wasteful users, you have to have meters and charge for water. People talk about water as a God-given right. Yes, might be, but to what extent? So you need to pay for water beyond a certain limit. Similarly, there's a polluter pays principle. If you're going to pollute, you will need to be charged. There's also promotion of water saving technology, not just for irrigating the sprinkler systems, but also in the use of water in households. Most people who are, whether it's bottom of the pyramid or 50% of our population, they do not have the lump sum available at a time in order to pay for these connections and meters. But there are microfinance schemes for these, and that might be part of the solution. The demand supply gap is not just about uncontrolled demand, it's also about that as insufficient supply. I think both needs to be looked at. Additional attention should be on droughts and solutions to address short-term crisis. Now, utilities are not only depending on the river waters and treating them and supplying, but they also need to integrate that with the rainwater harvesting and groundwater in planning the whole water for a city. I know there are some very interesting examples of resilient cities and smart cities, very nice to hear about, but Bangalore is part of that, Surat and Chennai, a Rockefeller Foundation, is looking at how do you really make cities resilient. And some new reservoir storage will be necessary, but creative solutions must exist. Now, I don't want to go into all the details, but some solutions are beginning to happen. Just look at the sanitation and sewerage issue. Singapore, New York, they are treating wastewater for agriculture or in situ cycling. But there are in India, the flaws in the monitoring process I've already mentioned about the Pollution Control Board. They are not doing these checking in a 24-hour basis because the pollutants are being released at night. And in the enforcement as well, corruption remains a problem. So what are the solutions now? Supply, it's about demand versus supply only approaches. Decentralized versus centralized only supply. So one needs to create incentives for also decentralized water supply systems. Soft versus hard only options, informal versus formal only sector. Institutional governance, this is one of the biggest challenges versus infrastructure only. Top down engineering solutions are not the only answer. And of course sewage as a resource versus sewage as a wastewater. Thank you.
tGELF, leading the change.